Parents of Reddit, what is the creepiest thing your young child has ever said to you? One of my baby cousins clearly said "Hail Satan," then started laughing hysterically while making strange, primal noises. My daughter told me she wanted to live with me and my wife forever. She's 17. So, I shouldn't throw him in the fire. 3-year-old daughter holding her baby brother for the first time. Yesterday my 3-year-old son told me, today's sister's birthday, I went into labor last night. Not my child, but my 3-year-old niece told my wife to dance in the middle of the room while she hid in a closet watching through the crack in the door. When my nephew was around 3 or 4, he called his father a demented peon. My brain is telling me to do things I don't want to do. He's 4. I jokingly asked, what's the best way to get a girlfriend? 7-year-old's response, tell her to be my girlfriend or she'll never see her parents again. Go back to sleep, there isn't anything under your bed. He's behind you now. Still haven't gotten over that one and shiver at the memory. My 3-year-old daughter stood next to her newborn brother and looked at him for a while, then turned and looked at me and said, Daddy, it's a monster. We should bury it. I was on a bus recently and we were stopped outside a walk-in clinic. A little girl in the seat in front of me turned to her dad and said, death is the poor man's doctor, and that was that. Edit, never realized this was an Irish proverb. Context, I'm Irish. Me, why are you crying? Son, badman. Me, what bad man? Son, there, points behind me at a dark corner of the room, lamp on bookshelf next to said darkened corner falls off as soon as I turn to look. She slept in our bed that night. I don't have kids, but once, visiting some friends on a farm, my buddy's youngest girl, 5 or 6 at the time, was afraid of the chickens. I tried to explain to her that the chickens weren't there to hurt us, but she wasn't having it. So, I'm sitting around the fire pit, looking at one of the chickens a few feet in front of me when I feel hot breath in my ear as she whispers, see. He's always watching, horrific and hysterical all at once. My mom has told me a story about my brother when he was younger. I guess he was sleepwalking and she was trying to coax him back to bed and he said something along the lines of, I would, but the devil is behind you. Yeah, no. When my 2-year-old and her friend were hanging out, the topic of T-Rex and other dinosaurs came up. I asked her friend, if you were a T-Rex, what would you do for fun? Quote. He answered, I'd chase herbivores. I then asked my daughter this question, if you were a T-Rex, what would you eat? Quote. She got very serious and looked me right in the eyes and said, children. I'd eat children. While not something my own child has said, my younger cousin, around 5 at the time, once drew a picture of a black monster, looked up at me, and said, he told me to draw this. He's coming for you. You better hide. When I was about 4, I would remember talking to Mr. Peterson whenever I was at my grandmother's house. He looked like a hobo from the Great Depression and had a guitar and sang me old-timey blues. He told me that he died when he fell off a train. He was riding whilst drunk on moonshine. I stopped seeing him when I was about 6. Anyway, 6 months ago I found my dad's old acoustic guitar and started playing, and my little cousin told me, Mr. Peterson is proud of you. And left. I don't know what to think. My mum's dad died 10 years before I was born. I was about 6 or 7 when my parents divorced. The day before my mum told me they were divorcing apparently, I was at the kitchen table drawing or something while my mum cooked tea. She says I stopped instantly and looked toward the front door as if I'd heard it open. I stared for a long time, then giggled, turned toward my mum and said, Granddad says don't worry, everything will be okay and he won't let anything bad happen. I then began humming and went back to my drawing. My mum says it's the single creepiest thing that's ever happened to her, and I have no memory of it happening. I have a daughter, and one day after her bath, she told me about this dream she had, where she was the monster terrorizing other kids. I found out later that she was being bullied, and this was right after Monsters Inc. came out, so it makes sense in hindsight. But I was shocked when she said how much she enjoyed hurting and scaring them. When my little sister first started talking, she used to say some really disturbing things. She used to tell us about how her old family would put things inside of her and would make her cry, but her daddy eventually burned her so much that she was able to find us, her new family. She spoke about things like that from the ages of almost 2 to 4. She was much too young to have ever been exposed to any content where children or anyone else could be sodomized, so my family has always thought she held memories of a prior life. We were having roast chicken for dinner. Son, 3, has lightbulb moment. Holds up chicken skin. When we say chicken skin, is this really the skin of the chicken? Like my skin. Next day after some Sunday nap page we play cars. I see a fresh scar on his foot. Straight line with a little dry blood. Ask the little sir about it. I cut myself. I took a knife because I wanted to see what my meat looks like under my skin, but it hurt a little, so I stopped. I still don't know, good thing he didn't want to see his sister's flesh. When I was about 3, we had a cat that had stillborn kittens. I asked my father if we could make crosses for them, which he did. As he was making them, I asked, "Aren't those too small?" "Dad, what do you mean, me? Aren't we going to nail them to them?" "Dad," after several moments' silence, "we're not going to do that." "Me? Oh." I was tucking in my 2-year-old. He said, "Goodbye, Dad." I said, "No, we say goodnight." He said, "I know. But this time it's goodbye." Had to check on him a few times to make sure he was still there. I was sound asleep, and at around 6 a.m. I was woken up by my 4-year-old daughter's face inches from mine. She looked right into my eyes and whispered, "I want to peel all your skin off." The backstory here is I had been sunburned the previous week and was starting to peel. In my sleep-addled state, however, it was pretty terrifying for a few seconds. I didn't know if I was dreaming, or what was going on. Around 4 or 5 months ago, at like 3 a.m. I was awoken by a very weird growling sound. Disoriented and in the dark, I started to come to and for the life of me couldn't figure out what the sound was. I had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, which added to my confusion. I was thinking maybe the cat had caught something, but really had no idea. As my vision started to come around, this 3-foot grotesque-looking shadow thing starts to appear a few feet in front of me. Just standing there growling. Creepy. Even though in reality it only took me a few seconds to figure out what was going on, I imagine my appearance would have been that of someone who was visibly shaken. It was my son. My 3-year-old son had snuck out of bed at 3 in the morning, found his Hulk mask in the dark, and decided to go find Daddy to play superheroes. I guess his idea of playing was to do a Hulk growl 2 feet from my sleeping face until I woke up in a panic. He ended up doing the same thing to my wife a few weeks later, which, to me, was way more hilarious. My toddler went through a phase where she would just constantly say, "hi," to things. Hi 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 hi. One day, it came out sounding more like die 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 die, so I say to her, "What's that you're saying?" And she turns to face me and just whispers, "Die." My kid's Catholic school is over 100 years old. There is a basement under the gym that's used for storage. I was subbing once and during recess one of the kickballs goes down the stairs. A little girl was standing at the top of the stairs yelling, "Just throw it up to me." I went over and asked who she was talking to and she replied, "That big man down the stairs." I went down and there was nobody down there and it was the only way in. I asked some of the other kids if they have seen the man before and they said, "Yes, but sister told us not to talk to him." I asked them to describe sister and they described a nun, and there haven't been nuns at the school in 40 years. Okay, backstory time. When I was a kid, Mr. Rand used to come into my room 4 or 5 times a week. He'd talk to me and tell me about stuff, and how he was killed in WW2. See, old mate Rand was a figment of my 4-year-old imagination. Anyway, one day when I was 9 or so, Mr. Rand stopped showing up. Fast forward to about 3 years ago and my son, who is about 5 at the time, walks out of his room one night at about 11:30 and says there's a man in his room. I flip out and run in his room to find nobody, to which he then says, "Mr. Rand said you can't see him anymore, but he's okay." The kid's got his own imaginary mate called Mr. Rand, but they only chat once or twice a year. My niece was sitting on the couch with a weird look on her face. Her mom asked her what she was thinking about, and she said, "I'm imagining the waves of blood rushing over me." Turned out they had been at a local science museum with an exhibit on the circulatory system. One of the features was a walk among some giant fake blood vessels, and she was remembering that. My son, about 6, asked my mother to lay down on her stomach, then he sat on her butt and started bouncing up and down and proclaimed, "Now we're mating like reptiles, thanks, Discovery Channel." So, a friend of mine was 6 years old when she told her mother that the lady who used to live here told me that she hates the wallpaper, and that you were covering her note. My friend's mom just thought it was making believe rambling and forgot about it. Well, 12 years later, when the mom is redecorating and taking down the wallpaper in the attic, she finds a suicide note scratched into the wall. The mom freaks the freak out and calls my friend and starts crying, asking if she remembered anything more about the women who spoke to her. My friend starts to recall the woman and starts to freak out, saying she only remembered talking to her in the attic. Not to me, but to his grandmother. He was cuddling with her and being very sweet. He was about 3 at the time. He takes her face in his hands, and brings his face close to hers, then tells her that she's very old, and will die soon. Then he makes a point of looking at the clock. I work in a preschool. Creepy shit gets said and done all the time. The one that sticks out to me happened last year. There is a small kitchenette area in our classroom that the kids use during free time for playing house or whatever pretend games they think up. There was one little girl that I was keeping a close eye on, mostly because of how withdrawn from the other kids she was. I noticed she was playing with a baby doll in the kitchenette, rocking it back and forth and singing to it. She then took the baby, shoved it into the play oven and slammed the door shut. She turned around, looked straight at me, and said, "Sometimes bad babies go in timeout," in the creepiest little girl voice I've ever heard before, smiling and running off. That one kind of shook me. When I was young, like maybe 2 years old, my grandma was in the hospital, dying of cancer. Obviously, I had no idea what was going on, but apparently one day when my mother and aunt were watching me, I suddenly looked at them and said, "Only one grandma." They kept trying to convince me otherwise, that no, I had 2 grandmas, but I kept repeating that line over and over. Then the phone rang. It was my uncle calling to tell my mother that my grandma had passed a few minutes ago.